everyone. We're going to be getting started today. So welcome to Nature Connects, the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists and nature experts from New England and around the world. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We've got a bigger audience today. Hello to the folks who have joined us via Zoom and also to those of you on Facebook Live. I'm your host, Lauren Dowd. Today, we're going to be talking about the ocean. It's vast, it's deep. Standing on the shore, it may seem to go on forever. While this makes it a wonderful resource, this belief has also led to the ocean being used as a dumping ground. Coastal pollution from our sewage, septic systems, cesspools, pit latrines, and more is impacting the health of coastal habitats and nearby communities that depend on a healthy ocean and fisheries. It's a problem here in Massachusetts and the Northeast, and even in my home state of Hawaii. Yet very few people are talking about this issue. And it is only getting worse as both the global population and the long list of toxic contaminants that find their way into our local water bodies grow. During this Nature Connects webinar, we'll hear from TNC's senior scientist and strategy advisor, Dr. Stephanie Weir. Steph makes the case for much needed innovation when it comes to protecting our coastal waters and how you can help be a voice for the ocean. After her presentation, she will take your questions. But first, a little bit more about Steph. Dr. Stephanie Weir is a marine ecologist, conservation strategy advisor, and global spokesperson at the Nature Conservancy. She is also a visiting scientist at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the Duke University Marine Lab. Throughout her career, Steph has focused on researching and developing new strategies to reduce threats to coral reefs and ocean ecosystems, paying special attention to how the fates of reefs and people are intertwined. Since joining TNC in 2001, she has worked with local communities to establish marine protected areas, developed strategies to address global drivers that threaten coral reefs, designed and led a global learning network for reef managers, conducted research on the impacts of pollution on ocean systems. Steph has become a recognized spokesperson for conservation. She has appeared on numerous media outlets, including NBC, CBS, Fox News, Time Magazine, Success Magazine, and as a guest on The Martha Stewart Show. She has appeared as an expert contributor on Disney's movie Oceans and in the BBC series The Power of Nature. She also has an upcoming short documentary series on food and climate change titled Eat Ugly that she hosted and co-produced. She was named one of Women's Health Magazine's Clean and Green Pioneers in April 2013, and Babbel.com's Moms Who Are Changing the World in 2011. Steph was selected as a member of the inaugural class of NatureNet Science Fellows, a path-breaking program sponsored by TNC and 6 leading universities that brings new approaches to solving global challenges around the sustainable provision of food, energy, and water. Before I hand it over to Steph, a few quick webinar notes. Her presentation will run for about 25 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. If you're on Zoom, please share questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems during the presentation, please let us know in the chat box and our team will reach out to assist you. And for the best view of the presentation, we recommend you go to the pull-down menu at the top center of your screen and choose Fit to Window. If you're watching from Facebook, you can submit questions via the comments section. Thanks again so much for joining today. Take it away, Steph. Steph, we can't hear or see you.
All right, how about that?
Yes, I can see you and hear you.
Funny. I started off saying that this is my first webinar and let's see how this goes. So there we go, that's how it goes. So can you see me okay now and hear me?
Yes, you're all set.
Okay, great. So I want to start by thanking the Massachusetts chapter for hosting this webinar, and thank you for joining me today to learn about my ocean conservation work. So I should warn you that we're going to be breaking some taboos today, and I'm going to be talking about things that are not your typical conservation fare, certainly not a dinner topic. So I wanted to start with a confession. I have developed a bit of an obsession with toilets. More than just toilets, it's what goes into them, what happens to that stuff, and where it ends up. And of course, how that impacts ocean health. And actually, it's really about what comes out of us and where that goes. And that's very important because many of us, more than half of all the people on the planet, are not using safe toilets or not using toilets at all. In many cases, the ocean is quite literally their toilet. Breaking it down, that's 2.5 billion people without a safe toilet option and another 2 billion that may have something like a pit latrine, but it doesn't properly treat the waste and it gets discharged into surface waters or in the environment. So it's a big mess. You might be feeling a little confused right now if you didn't read the intro to this talk, because I'm a marine biologist and coral reef conservationist, and you might have expected me to tell you I was going to take you on this wild journey to the tropics and share beautiful photos of crystal clear blue waters and technicolor coral reefs. And that would be pretty nice right now, given all that's going on in the world. So here is your picture. I took this in Palau years ago, and it feels like forever at this point. And this was my old life. I did work in places like this. My story does begin on a tropical island, though. Next slide. The beautiful island of St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands. It's where my career began back in 2001. My work was focused on helping to figure out how to best protect the coastal waters in the Virgin Islands and in the Caribbean. And I had this beautiful drive to work every morning, driving along the coastal road bordered by a barrier reef just offshore. I drove on an island. I had an island Jeep, and the top was always down. The windows were always down because I had no air conditioning. And I drove right over every morning a raw sewage flow. It was hard to miss. And it was flowing right through town and right into the harbor, just yards away, the very harbor that I was working to protect. So I should note that this was not the only raw sewage flow on St. Croix, nor was it unique to the Virgin Islands or the Caribbean or tropical islands, or as I have learned, developing countries. But I'll get to that later. So that drive stuck with me. It bothered me. But what was more confusing to me was why nobody seemed to care about it. It was just accepted as fact of life. So I was young, I was given an assignment, and I focused on that. I worked on creating marine protected areas, and from there, my work evolved, and I started working globally. And in that work, I focused on climate change and its impacts on coral reefs, and what we could do to minimize the threat of rising temperatures in the ocean. But during that decade or so, my first sort of chunk of decade of work, that sewage flow kept nagging at me in the back of my mind. And I was often reminded of it because I kept coming across similar situations in the different places that I visited and worked. I was curious about what seemed to be intuitive, that it couldn't be good for coral reefs, but there wasn't a lot of evidence. And after some exploration and learning about just how little we actually knew, very little science, I decided to take a deep dive into sewage pollution. Next slide. So long story short, I stepped back from my role as director, of coral reef conservation for our oceans team, our global oceans team. And for a couple of years, I conducted research and I got my PhD to better understand this threat to coral reefs. And as I would learn, a threat to oceans in general. So this is a breakdown of what I learned during my PhD. Ocean sewage pollution is a serious threat to oceans and people. Ocean sewage pollution is a pervasive threat, and it's pervasive across the globe. Ocean sewage pollution has been ignored. Now, there are many reasons for the ignored part that we could talk about all day, but we're not going to talk about that today. That's the part, though, that I'm trying to change in my current work. And it starts with this, with sharing with you. Sharing with you marks the beginning of an effort to inspire sewage pollution ambassadors. Doesn't that sound fun? That will share this problem. So I want you to share this problem with your friends and your families and your colleagues. And I want you to get enough information today to get the word out and get people talking and ultimately surface problem solvers. We need problem solvers. I sit before you today admitting that we don't have all the answers right now. Next slide. So what is both scary and exciting for me is that in many ways we are starting from scratch. It's mostly scary. This isn't a threat that we have tackled in many places. So we are building our toolbox. We are learning from what others have already done, and we're figuring out our role in this space. Because this space has a lot happening, right? I mean, we're talking about sanitation. So there are other sectors totally devoted to addressing the global sanitation crisis, including public health, development, sanitation organizations. They just aren't thinking about oceans as they do that work. In fact, often the oceans are the solution to their problem. Their goal is to get the waste to the ocean. So let's talk a little bit about why that's a problem for oceans. Next slide. So I'm going to give you the basics, and most of this will not be surprising to you. It's pretty intuitive, which is why it is such a surprise to me that so little has been done in this space. Sewage is pretty much a toxic cocktail for ocean habitats. While it's primarily composed of human excreta, poop and pee, I said it, breaking taboo, it also contains the medicines we ingest, like hormone replacement therapies, chemotherapies, antidepressants, antibiotics. And then there's the pathogens, which we all have heard more than we probably ever care to hear about for the rest of our lives. And all the other things that we flush down the toilets. To keep it simple, lots of nasty things. And each of these components on their own pose health risks to the ocean and to ocean organisms. But in combination, their impacts can be amplified and in a sort of pile-on scenario. Examples of the sort of impacts documented include reduction in biodiversity, impairment of reproductive ability and success. So do they have babies, grandbabies, great-grandbabies? Stunting of growth, and even changes in body shape and size in certain organisms. Next slide. So much of the science is focused on the nutrient component. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. These are really important nutrients for plants, but when you have too much, just in most cases in life, it can throw systems out of balance and entirely shift community composition, say from a coral reef, which is really important to ocean health, to an algae reef, which is bad. Or it can create environmental and human health concerns, like with harmful algal blooms, commonly known as red tides or brown tides. You hear about these in the news. Now, the impacts on marine systems, these impacts are not new, but they've mostly been attributed to agricultural activity, including fertilizer applications. And why we have ignored this contribution of sewage to the system is complex and not necessarily well understood. Maybe it's because the agricultural activity is so visible and the scale can be easily understood. Maybe it's taboo. Regardless, agriculture has been given credit for almost all nutrient pollution in marine ecosystems. But we know now that agriculture is only part of the story. It's in a very big and important part, but it's part of the story. Put simply, sewage pollution has a long list of negative effects on coastal habitats. Some of these even making these habitats more susceptible to climate change. Next slide, please. So how big of a problem is this and how common is it? And it turns out that untreated sewage flowing into coastal waters is more common than anyone might imagine. In many cases, it's the norm. My initial work focused on coral reefs, obviously, that's my gig. And what I found was that in 112 coral reef geographies that have people, obviously, that is countries, states, and territories that have lots of reef, 104 of that 112 had a documented sewage pollution problem. As I dove deeper, I discovered that this problem was not limited to the tropics and developing countries, but was in fact a problem right in our own backyards. Next slide. So very few countries have actually figured out ways in which to effectively treat human sewage without causing environmental or human health issues. For example, in hundreds of US cities, we have combined sewer overflows. These are systems that combine the storm water pipes and the sewer pipes so that when it rains, these two flows combine and they're released into whatever water body they're next to, because the rainwater would otherwise overwhelm the sewage treatment plant. The city of New York discharges about 27 billion gallons of untreated sewage and polluted stormwater into the New York Harbor every year. The US discharges about 1.2 trillion gallons of untreated sewage into coastal waters annually. 1.2 trillion. More than 80% of sewage in developing countries is discharged untreated, polluting rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. This is everyone's problem. Next slide. So besides the fact that this is a big ocean problem, there was another reason I was drawn to this challenge and actually did a PhD on sewage, people. And I just want to share, these are actually some kids in Dominican Republic. The outhouses from their community basically drain into this mangrove area where the livestock feed and the children play. So this is, this is kind of what it can look like in a community. So people, the impacts on human health and well-being are significant. Children are the most impacted, with about 800,000 children under the age of 5 dying every year due to diarrheal disease associated with unsafe sanitation. That's 2,200 children every day. So many more people are getting sick, become disabled, miss work, and are economically impacted. These are issues that are all interconnected. When you have people getting sick, and in some cases even dying from a polluted environment or dirty water or contaminated food, you lose both the contribution of that individual to their community as problem solvers and contributors to their community, but also you put greater pressure on the environmental resources due to the intensification of poverty associated with illness and disability. Women and girls are particularly impacted, with many girls dropping out of school at puberty because there is no toilet at school. When you get down to it, women and girls really are the biggest losers here. And this is really a concern from a humanitarian and gender equity perspective, but it's also a concern from an environmental perspective. A recent study called Project Drawdown looked at the top 100 solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And they found that by empowering women and educating girls, you could reduce more greenhouse gas emissions than any other solution they found, 12 years worth of carbon emissions. So if you're worried about climate change and or ocean health like me, let's get these gals some ocean-friendly toilets ASAP. In fact, when you review the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, solving this problem is tied to almost all of the UN's goals. This issue is integral. And what I love about solving this problem is that there are all of these co-benefits well beyond ocean health, including reduced dependence on fossil fuels, food security, and poverty alleviation, all things very intertwined with conservation. Some of these co-benefits are going to be illustrated in some of the solutions that I'm going to show to you in a minute. So like I said at the beginning, we have just begun this work. We are building a movement, really a revolution of sorts, and we're working to elevate this problem so that we can start experimenting and innovating and reducing the threat to oceans. So how do we do that? To borrow a phrase that I have heard almost daily in the last 6 months in relation to a different public and environmental health crisis, we are in uncharted territory. But we have some interesting models from which to learn. Next slide. The good news in all of this is that we can work with and learn from the public health sector, from those that have been working in this space for decades. Over the last decade or so, there's been a bit of a toilet revolution, hence my obsession with toilets. It's actually what inspired me to step away from my job and go get my PhD in sewage. In 2012, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation started the Reinvent the Toilet initiative. They challenged inventors and engineers and pretty much whoever to design a toilet that didn't use water, that didn't use electricity or septic, that operated on less than 5 cents a person a day, and that produced valuable resources like drinking water and fertilizer and fuel, and finally, most interesting to me, that did not pollute the environment. This is like a dream toilet. If I'm gonna dream about toilets, I'm not saying I would dream about this toilet. So I saw this as a win-win, and it got me revved up and wanting to learn more and figure out how we might partner with groups who are working in this space. Next slide. So I just want to pause and say one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy about how we manage human waste, especially in many developed countries, is that we take perfectly good treated drinking water and use it to flush our toilets, immediately creating a huge demand on infrastructure and energy to try to get that water clean again, enough to discharge or in best cases scenario, reuse. So we are facing water and other resource shortages, and yet we do something that is, it just contradicts everything. It makes no sense, and it's literally a total waste. We're making everything harder for ourselves. So the strategies I get most excited about are ones that avoid this sort of waste and solve more than one problem. Triple wins. I get greedy when I'm looking for outcomes. Next slide. So here is a system that transforms the dirty water into drinking water. They call this toilet to tap. It sounds delicious, right? So there are actually some really great examples of this working at a larger scale, including Orange County in Southern California. Next slide. So here's a toilet that turns waste into electricity. And I love the fact that your trip to the loo or the toilet or whatever can actually reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. That's off the grid. I'm looking for off the grid right now. So next slide. The next toilet is actually the toilet I'm starting to think about putting in at my house. This is a biogas toilet, and it produces clean fuel that you can use in cook stoves, which reduces indoor air pollution, which is another really substantial human health challenge. So there are some great examples of natural solutions too. We call this sanitation by and for nature. Next slide. So here is a constructed wetland. It's a schematic, and this costs much less to build and operate and maintain than a conventional treatment solution. And it provides multiple benefits to the system besides treating wastewater. For example, something we care very much about, habitat. In fact, we put a wastewater treatment wetland in at the office where I worked in St. Croix back in like 2002. And it was awesome. And it attracted all kinds of cool birds and other native species. And you never would have guessed it was treating all of our waste. It just looked like a pretty wetland. Everybody liked to visit it, see whatever was blooming. The Nature Conservancy is actually participating in a working group right now that is focusing on such nature-based solutions. And we're developing guidelines for sanitation managers so that they can make informed choices about using natural solutions to meet their sanitation goals. We're really trying to promote the use of natural solutions, given all the co-benefits of that. Next slide. Okay, so you get the idea. This is actually an actual constructed wetland. There's a lot of innovation happening. When I visited the Gates Foundation back in 2012, I wanted to know if they were aware of the environmental benefits, if they were thinking about this, in this toilet revolution that they had inspired. And they said that they realized that there were going to be other benefits to this, and they didn't really understand them very well. And they were really just focused on their mission, restoring human health and dignity, which is totally understandable and very important. Since then, we've continued to bug them and engage with them and learn from their work, and they are very generous with their lessons learned. One of the things I have learned early on from the Gates team was that this wasn't just text problem to solve. Wouldn't that be nice, right? This is very complicated, and there are all these other social factors at play, including social acceptance, economic affordability, maintenance issues, and the gender considerations. Tech is only really one piece of the puzzle. And right now, it very much feels like a puzzle to me. Next slide. So this is a puzzle that I need your help with and the help of my conservation peers across the planet to solve. Pretty much everybody, really. We're all contributing to this. Last fall, we gathered a small group of renegade thinkers from many sectors to help us think and figure out exactly what our role was in this space. And that already felt crowded, right? There's public health, there's engineering, there's development organizations. We thought through what our entry point would be, how and if we could actually contribute. And what we came to was that we had many entry points, and that we had a really important role to play as the voice of the ocean. It was a missing voice until now, and that was the good news. The challenge we have is that this voice is very small right now, and it's very crowded. There's a lot going on in the world. We can't solve a problem that people don't know exists. In order for us to be successful of working, and working across sectors and working with governments and working with communities on the ground, first people need to know that what has been the mantra and practice for decades and perhaps centuries, that solution to pollution is dilution. This is just wrong. It's a great rhyme, but you just need to erase it from your minds. So in the coming months and years, we will be making some noise And this is not a typical strategy for me, sitting in an organization whose tagline was once quietly doing conservation. But we are going to be raising our voices so that people first understand that we have to end the out of sight, out of mind, flush it and forget it mindset. That we need to talk about this problem, put some daylight on it, break down those taboos. This is part of every human's daily life. We need to be able to talk about it. So we want to see problem solvers rise to the challenge, show up, and help us work through this. Next slide. One of my key findings in my dissertation work was that this threat was known to coral reef managers and even considered a top 3 threat. Yet very few resources or time were being allocated to address it. This felt crazy to me when I realized this. So we know it's a problem, and yet we focus our efforts on other equally important strategies, such as protecting, protected areas and fisheries management and restoration, all very important. Meanwhile, all of these approaches are dependent on a common factor, good water quality. For these efforts to be successful, good water quality is essential. So why is this happening? Well, as I've learned, there are many reasons, and as with anything in conservation, it's complicated. Some of my new work is focused on addressing some of the drivers of the situation, the hurdles, the roadblocks, trying to figure out how to end this long-standing problem. And as we expand more into this space, we are going to be taking a multi-pronged approach and getting creative. Obviously, creativity is called for. So first, we build off the existing work at the Nature Conservancy in this space. And there has been some real pioneers in parts of New England, Long Island, and more recently, Hawaii. We're learning from what they have learned. We're going to share it, and we're going to build upon it. We are building a body of resources for practitioners, including online resources and case studies, so that they have a one-stop shop to learn about this problem and figure out where their opportunities are for them to step into the space and begin work, actually start mitigating the threat. We're going to make these resources available to anyone interested in learning more. They're not ready yet, hopefully by the end of the year. We're also beginning to scope out opportunities with partners in some of the places we work, including the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean. And so we want to get more skin in the game, and so that we can learn faster and we can share more. We're also working across sector to engage, learn, and collaborate and increase the likelihood of successful outcomes for oceans. We can't do this alone, right? So finally, we're developing social campaigns that will help to break down the taboos, bring this conversation out into the open so that it is a normal part of the conservation conversation. Say that 3 times fast. Okay, so next slide. Like many of the ocean conservation challenges we face, this one is massive. But what excites me about it, it's solvable. Not with a single magic solution, but with many different solutions, some that we know about and some that will emerge as partially in result of our efforts to start talking toilets. And it starts with you. My request is this. Besides sharing what you learned today with friends and family and colleagues, really anyone you run across, you'd be surprised by the interesting conversations I've had with perfect strangers about this issue. Often too much information, but it's always interesting. I want you to do some literal home work and find out what happens after you flush in your own home or your community, or if you have sewers and a treatment plant, find out what kind of treatment and what happens with that effluent. If you're on a septic, find out how old your system is, how efficient it is. Make sure that you're up to date on your maintenance, that you're not leaking. I have a colleague that bought a small farm with septic and learned a few years after that they were not in fact on septic, and they just had a straight pipe to a stream right on their property where their dog used to play. So get curious. If what you learn doesn't sit well, get involved. You can always support the ongoing work and emerging work in this space as we seek to identify the best options for ocean-friendly sanitation and ocean-friendly sewage treatment. This, like most conservation problems, will be solved at the local level. This is something you have a say in, and I hope you will lift your voice. Next slide. Thank you. I'm happy to chat about this. I love to talk about this, talk about it all day. So happy to take questions.
Awesome. That was terrific and super informative stuff. Thank you. I know I learned a lot that I just haven't been conditioned to think about on a daily basis. So I really appreciate this learning opportunity as well. And I'm sure so much of our audience has. Now we'll move into the question and answer portion of the webinar. Just as a reminder for everyone listening, if you think of questions for Steph, please share them in the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or via the Facebook comments section, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. To start off, Steph, this seems like a really big problem that is hidden in plain sight. And I think you talked about this a little bit, but could you talk about, based on your experience, like why this is and some of the things that have effectively helped engage communities in this issue?
So the why is really interesting. I really do think a lot of it has to do with taboo. We don't like to think about it. You know, in the developed world, in most parts of the US, many parts of the US, we have a flushable toilet, right? And it's just not something you want to think about. I don't know. It's just part of our culture. It's part of, maybe it's not human nature. Maybe it is cultural. But so it's not proper conversation. It's considered rude to discuss. And I also think that, you know, when we're building lots of big we're doing lots of big infrastructure projects, I think people rather show a beautiful new road or a beautiful new school or library than talk about their sewage treatment. So I think there are some real issues of the fact that it's just not a popular area of discussion. In terms of engaging, what I find really interesting about this is as soon as you bring it up, everybody's really excited. It's like you just have to break down that barrier and break down that taboo. And people want to tell, I mean, I've had so many crazy stories and people coming up to me after I've talked about this to tell me what their experience has been and all the problems that they have faced with it. It's just really about starting the conversation. And I actually, and some of my colleagues in the Caribbean, when we talked about launching this scoping exercise in the Caribbean, I was worried they were going to say, you know, we have got so much to do. There's so much. We're so overwhelmed. We just can't handle thinking about this right now. And in fact, their response was, thank you. Thank you for helping us begin this work and think about this work. This has been bothering us forever and we haven't known where to begin. So I think it's just a matter of being that sort of squeaky wheel. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know that you have a new paper coming out soon. Can you give us a little sneak peek before it's published?
Yeah, so the paper that I have coming out is interesting in that it's not oceans focused. So I think we're going to share a number of the papers that I've written. They're pretty easy for an audience that maybe doesn't have a scientific background. They're pretty easy to read, so I encourage you, if you want to learn more about this, to check those out. This paper is around the global sanitation crisis and how it's affecting, well, you know, our natural environment well beyond oceans. It's not just oceans. It's affecting our terrestrial environments. It's affecting our freshwater environments. And there are different mechanisms for that depending on how waste is disposed. But we just have a problem with how we treat it and manage it. And it affects all of, it affects everything, really, all of our natural environment. So that's what that paper is about.
Awesome, looking forward to it. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in for you. First one, you're really excited about, or should we be excited about low flow toilets? I think they were initially designed to save water, but do they also have a beneficial impact on sewage? It seems like they would. Is it a good thing or just something that we think is good?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, I'm a big fan personally of low flow toilets because they are addressing that issue that I mentioned that drives me crazy, that we're wasting so much water to flush. So I would say low flow toilets are a great thing to consider. I'm actually not clear on how they relate to this as much. I would imagine there's less liquid that has to be managed. So I would say, just from an environmental perspective, that a low flow toilet is a really good place to start in thinking about this problem. So you're not contributing to, you know, that treatment of more drinkable water.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question, how different are the strategies where there is an existing sewage treatment that wants to be improved versus an area where raw sewage is dumped directly into the ocean?
Right. So one of the things we say is any treatment is better than no treatment. So, any kind of way to remove waste from the natural environment is better than nothing. But there are just a whole range of choices. So there are a lot of places, like I said, there are billions of people that don't have any sanitation. And so that is a huge challenge. This is not obviously a challenge that the Nature Conservancy is going to take on. That is not part of our mission, but we certainly want to support those that are and have that voice of the environment, that voice of the oceans in the back of their heads as they're working on it. But there are things that can be done, and we're learning more. There's new technologies really in development, and we're learning more and more every day about ways you can retrofit existing systems to improve the treatment level, where you can, doing things that right now aren't common in a municipal centralized sewer treatment system, like remove pharmaceuticals. We need to figure out how to do that. We need to figure out how to remove more nitrogen from the system. So there are things that just aren't a part of current treatment because they weren't such an issue back when those were installed. We weren't thinking about personal care products and all the different medicines that we were ingesting. So there are big differences between the sort of strategy you would take on, but there are ways to retrofit and improve the treatment of existing systems.
Great. And speaking of all the things that end up going down the toilet, we got a question from Facebook about the role toilet paper can play in pollution.
Yeah, so toilet paper, it really depends, right? So like I actually live on a property that has septic, and there are more septic-friendly toilet papers, things that break down more easily. One of the big no-nos actually is those wet wipes. They clog systems and create huge challenges for the efficiency of systems. So as much as that sounds like maybe a good personal decision, it's a really poor decision for the environment and really not recommended. Yeah, I mean, in our household, I mean, I've already broken taboo. We're a big fan of bidets, but at the same time, bidets use more of that water. So this is a problem. There aren't really good solutions. I mean, if you're using lots of toilet paper, that's a tree issue. If you're using lots of water, that's a water issue. We just need to do a better job of figuring this out for us, because it's, everybody has to have this problem solved, right? There's nobody on the planet that doesn't have this issue. So yeah, toilet paper, I would just use less of it for the trees, but as long as it's a easily biodegradable toilet paper, I don't think it's as big of a deal.
Thanks for clarifying that.
But I'm not an expert on toilet paper. I should say that.
Awesome. So we've got a couple questions about effects on reefs. So one about how much of a connection there is between sewage and the algae blooms that you've talked about, as well as the impact of sewage pollution on the ability of coral reefs to protect shoreline communities from storms, which is another big thing that I know we've heard on at the Nature Conservancy.
Let's break those down so that I can remember. Okay, so the first one was around algal blooms.
Yeah.
Coral reefs. Okay. So this is actually something I used to talk about a lot before I got kind of honed in on sewage, which is on a coral reef, it's kind of this battle between algae or seaweed and corals. Seaweeds can grow fast. They love high nutrient environments, and they grow fast, and they can completely take up the space and the light on a coral reef. And if they do that, they can smother a coral reef. Corals are very slow growing. They need lots of light, and they actually thrive in low nutrient environments. So if you have a whole bunch of nitrogen or nutrients in the system, you have a real problem, because the corals can just be totally overwhelmed by the macroalgae. So that is a real issue. And that's compounded by the fact that we have been overfishing our reefs. Fish can play a really important role to keep the macroalgae in check. They can graze it, right? And they can remove it and eat it. And there are actually really cool stories about on a coral reef how there's this chemical warfare going on, and that there are fish that actually protect coral reefs from this overgrowth of macroalgae. And the coral sends out a signal when it starts literally feeling contact from an invading macroalgae, and sends out a signal, and these fish show up within 15 minutes and graze and remove the seaweed, like, you know, clip their hold fast or whatever. They don't even necessarily eat it, they just remove it. So there's all this cool chemistry. It's one of my favorite things about reefs, the chemistry of coral reefs. But that is a huge issue. Nutrients are just bad news on a coral reef. They like that crystal clear blue water is clear because there aren't a lot of nutrients in it, and it's essential for coral reefs to survive. Okay, now the second question was about coastal protection. Can you repeat that? Oh, you're muted.
How does sewage pollution affect the ability of coral reefs to protect shoreline communities from storms? So I think you might have answered that a little bit in terms of how it affects the coral itself.
So basically, well, coral, that's, you know, whoever is asking that question obviously understands that coral reefs play a really important role in coastal protection. And so for those that aren't familiar with this, they protect 200,000 kilometers of, is that right? Is that right? Sorry, I'm pretty sure that's right. 200,000 kilometers of coastline. It's something around, it's several hundred million people that are protected by coral reefs. So they act as a barrier. You hear the term barrier reef, but not all reefs are barrier reefs. But it acts as a barrier. It breaks the wave energy so that that coastal area and that coastal community can actually be there. Otherwise, the waves would come in and erode the coastline. So they play this really important role in protecting coastlines. If they are compromised in any way, whether that is from pollution, from, you know, destruction from boat damage, overfishing, because the fish play such an important role in maintaining that strong, healthy reef, any of those things can compromise the reef's ability to protect coastlines. So if you've got lots of nutrients in the environment, you are going to have a weakened reef and a weakened protection. And that protection is extraordinarily valuable. You can imagine there are a lot of places in the world that would not have a community there because they're not protected. So super important service that reefs provide to people.
Definitely. Awesome. So we've got a bunch of questions all around the same topic, asking whether there are locations around the world that are getting it right and could be models for innovation. Yeah,
so on this, there are only a few places that I'm currently aware of. We're actually doing a big search solution scan right now to try to identify those places. If you're thinking about, let's start with the temperate environment, right? Because this isn't just about coral reefs. The Nature Conservancy is working in Long Island and has been working on this for about 10 years and figuring out that a lot of the problems in the water quality in Long Island Sound were due to leakage and overflowing of septic systems into Long Island Sound. And so there's really exciting work coming from that team, figuring out what the problem was. That was a big one, trying to figure out why there was a health issue with the shellfish community and the seagrass communities and just water quality in general. So first figuring that out, and then figuring out and working with scientists from SUNY Stony Brook, for example, where they're figuring out technologies where they can retrofit the septic systems in really simple ways, ways that could be used in other parts of the world, not just in temperate communities. And so that's a cool example. That's an example I'm following really closely, and I want to be sharing with others just to see all that they've been through and all that they've learned. There are also examples in the tropics. Our colleagues at Coral Reef Alliance that work in Honduras have found some success in going into a community, understanding that there is a water quality problem, and working with the community to install safe sanitation, ocean-friendly sanitation, and are starting to see the positive benefits of that. There are some parts of the world that just do a better job of this because they already have this appreciation for how precious water is in general. And you know, you think about arid environments, they do a lot more of water reuse and recycling, and they just don't let the water flow into the environment because they need that water, right? Because they're out in an arid environment. there are places like Singapore that are doing some pretty interesting things, parts of Northern Europe. Some different places have examples, but it's not as many as we would hope for our purposes. We're trying to sort of develop our strategy here. So there's still a lot to learn.
Yeah, definitely. In a related vein, is the Nature Conservancy focusing at all on a specific scale? Because, you know, treatment solutions for, say, an urban area or a city are going to look very different for a smaller village. So how are we addressing all those different scales?
So scale is probably one of the biggest discussions we've had about this work. There is a lot of work going on in North America. We have an urban water program that's thinking about cities, and they're thinking about stormwater, and they are thinking about wastewater. Sometimes they're thinking about one or the other, and sometimes both. And there's a number of sites throughout across North America that are thinking about it at the urban level. You know, when you think about coral reefs, you have a whole mix of, you know, rural to urban. And so what we've decided to do is focus on where the ocean habitat is most important and figure out what the solutions are for that place, where, because, you know, and high density areas of people where people are really having that impact. So we're actually trying to generate now a threat layer or a map that shows us the hot spots. Where do people and oceans meet? Because you're going to have a sewage problem in those places. So we're going to have to do some priority setting, but we haven't gotten to that part of this process yet.
Good to know. And so also in a related vein, what can we do about our current toilet flushing issues in cities? You know, what would it take to change our urban sewer systems and using, you know, clean, fresh water to flush toilets?
Yeah, well, it's complicated. It's possible. I've been reading about plans for updating sewage systems and thinking about actually changing these connections where sewers and sewer pipes and stormwater pipes combine. I haven't yet come across, I don't want to say it hasn't happened yet, because this is like a rabbit hole. When you get into this information, you're just sort of going all over, learning what's going on where. But it does look like there are some places that are starting to think about how they might shift this. I know New York is definitely exploring it. But, you know, the challenge we face actually is that our infrastructure just in the US, so just talking about that because this is a problem everywhere, is more than 100 years old, our piping infrastructure. And we have about 1 million miles of pipe that actually need to be replaced in the US alone. So as we're doing that, as we're having to go back and update and upgrade, because, you know, you've got places that have sewer, you know, water main breaks all the time. That's because those pipes are old. It's the opportunity to go in and solve this problem and redesign. But it's hard. It's all often underground. So there's a lot of digging that's going to be done and a lot of disruption.
Yeah. What about plumbing designs that use gray water from sinks and showers for toilets? Is that becoming more of a popular option?
I hope it's becoming a popular option. You know, it's interesting. These things are really local, right? So I built a house, and at the time I was working on this, and I wanted to be a good example, and I wanted to figure out how to use a gray water system in our house so that we were being more efficient with our water use. And I came up against so much resistance and code issues. So one of the things, sort of building code issues, and this was told at one point, well, we'd have to create 2 plumbing systems in our house, like double the plumbing in our house. Nobody was really up for figuring out that challenge. You need partners to help you work through this. So one of the challenges, one of the things that are having to be done in places that are upgrading their systems is they're having to go back and revisit those codes and the regulations and create the enabling conditions for people to more easily make those choices.
Yeah, definitely. And then on the other side of things, for those of the people who are on septic systems, are there any promising technology innovations that treat the effluent more effectively, that are also cost effective?
Yeah. So, okay, I have to be clear that I'm a coral reef person, but I'm learning about these things. So I'm not going to use the perfect language. But one of the things that I'm excited about is this work that's come out of the Stony Brook Water Institute. I probably have it's Clean Water Institute, maybe, run by Chris Gobler at Stony Brook. They're looking at retrofitting and adding an extra component to a septic system that removes more nitrogen from the system using simple, easily accessible items like wood chips, or if you're in a tropical location, coconut husks. So something very simple and straightforward that breaks down the microbes in those wood chips, break down the nitrogen, and much lower levels of nitrogen in the effluent. So there are some things that are coming, and what we need to do is create the environment for them to be taken up. You can't just have new technology and use it. Sometimes you're really limited by the existing regulations in place and the cost. If you've got a perfectly functioning, one of the things that Stuart Lowry from our Long Island chapter said to me was, we've got this challenge in Long Island with all these septic systems that are failing. And the people that own these homes didn't do anything wrong. We're asking them to make a very significant, potentially asking them to make a very significant investment to update and fix their systems. So they didn't do anything wrong. And all of a sudden they got this big bill. So we have to figure out how to better finance these things so it's not a burden on households to fix the problem. And they've got some pretty creative ways in dealing with that so that it's possible to upgrade.
Awesome. And you mentioned sort of regulations and policy a little bit. Could you talk a bit more about combined sewer overflows and how can residents advocate for upgrades in their cities?
So it's interesting. I think being an advocate is really important. When I talk about lifting your voice, that is exactly what I'm talking about. Finding out how it's managed where you are. There are, I'm thinking somewhere around at least 300 US cities that have this design in how they manage their water. So this is like showing up at city council meetings, talking to your local leaders, getting groups together to put pressure on your local leaders to address the issue. I've seen it happen, in Florida. One of the pictures I showed was this big sewage pipe underwater, and there were scuba divers around it with fish at the end, and there was this brown, gook coming out of the pipe. And that was in Florida. That was primary treated sewage, which means they removed the solids. That's the first stage of sewage treatment. But everything else was, going. Solids probably include things like wipes, those wet wipes and baby wipes. But nobody really knew that that's what Florida was doing. They have these pipes all along the coast of Florida, piping this primary treated sewage off the coast. And scuba divers found it, and of course we're grossed out. Looking around, you could see slimy reef bottom. And so they raised awareness around it. They showed videos, they took pictures, people saw it, and they were pretty upset because these are off some beautiful, pristine beaches. And so that kind of awareness campaign put pressure on the local government and the state government to make changes, and started figuring out a better way to discharge and treat their sewage.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So we've got a couple questions about who in New England or in Massachusetts is working on the solutions. And I know that's not your complete area of expertise, but if there is anything you wanted to say, feel free to jump in. And we can also put a couple of links in the chat, and you're welcome to follow up with the Massachusetts chapter if you would like to know more about some local projects.
Yeah, I'm just learning about what's going on in Massachusetts. As you can imagine, I'm trying to learn about what's going on all over the world because we're looking for examples to learn from. And there's some pretty exciting work looking at water quality and climate resilience. Climate resilience is really dependent on this issue. We have to have good water quality. Those habitats like salt marshes that protect coastal areas need to be in good condition and not polluted. So so all of these things are interlinked. That's one of the things I've really come to with all of this work, is how interconnected everything is. It sort of blows your mind when you start drawing all the connections. But they've got a big project out that they're working on and beginning out in Cape Cod, and I would really encourage people to learn more about that. But there's a lot more going on. Massachusetts is actually one of those pioneers in terms of really thinking about their coastal water quality, which I'm grateful for because I want to learn what they're doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We are approaching the end of our time today, so I want to give you a little bit of time, Steph, in case you have any final thoughts you'd like to share. And also, where can people find and follow your work?
Yeah, so my final thoughts are just, I'm grateful that people are tuning in to learn about this issue. You know, for me, over the next couple of years, it's really going to be about this, talking to people, sharing it, and at the same time learning about how to solve it. You know, it's a weird space to be in, and I've been at the Nature Conservancy for 19 years, and I always felt like I had some sort of roadmap when I began my work. But this one's different and it's challenging, and so following our work will be, you'll be hearing from us. We're going to be putting out, you know, social campaign information, videos, new things that we're learning. We'll share them through the Nature Conservancy channels. We have some website content where you can get more into some of the science and whatnot. Some of it's going to be on Nature Conservancy hosted websites. Like reefresilience.org, and some of it's going to be on a partner website of ours. The California Environmental Associates have a website called oursharedseas.com, and we will be sharing content there. That should be live in a couple of months. So we'll be sharing this. If you follow our channels, we'll be sharing these things. And that's probably the best way to follow right now. And yeah, I'm just grateful. The more people I can talk to about this issue, the better. And I just want to emphasize how important it is to start with your own home and your own, you know, what's going on with you. I personally am now, I've just moved to a new house, and we are making plans to get that biogas toilet. We've decided we've got a place for it. We're going to experiment because we figure, how can we talk about this if we're not at least trying it for ourselves? So I encourage you. It's an interesting adventure. For sure.
Sounds like it. Well, thank you so much. And we got a great comment in the chat saying that a company called Witten does global consulting on water quality and treatment options based out of Sandwich, Massachusetts, for anyone in the area who might want to look into that.
That's great. I'm looking for that new information.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Steph, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone else who tuned in and for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. You can also find the full webinar schedule and other past recordings at nature.org/MA-webinars. If you're enjoying these events, please share them with your friends. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with our staff. And join us for next week's webinar on Thursday, August 6th. We'll be joined by author Fred Rich and TNC's Chief External Affairs Officer Lynn Scarlett to discuss the need for dialogue and bipartisan support as we chart the course toward a sustainable planet. We'll be sending invitations out soon, and you can always register at nature.org/MA-webinars. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, guys.